А как в Украине оказался?
Я переехал по своему желанию.
В каком году?
В 23-м.
То есть война уже что?
Да,
То есть вы из России поехали, чтобы воевать на Украине?
да.
В Харьковской области какие задачи выполняли?
Такой же задача. У меня была задача усиления приграничного отряда на ВОПе 116. Мы должны были наблюдать и в случае нападения отразить его.
При каких обстоятельствах попали?
Во время боя 10 мая мы вели бой с русским отрядом. Они закидали нас гранатами, и мы укрывались в блиндаже. После этого мы сложили оружие и подняли руки вверх и просили нас не убивать.
The situation for Ukraine is rapidly deteriorating ahead of the expected Russian summer counteroffensive. Several defense lines have collapsed, and entire Ukrainian brigades have abandoned their positions or simply refused to fight. So the obvious question is, will Russia precipitate a total military collapse on Ukraine by applying pressure on several areas of the front line? Or will the Ukrainian army and the government break and collapse on their own? Recent events show that the latter may be the more likely, and if true, could occur rather suddenly this summer. A military historian, Michael Vlahos, wrote a very insightful article in August of last year predicting this collapse that we are now seeing in Ukraine. And here's how he stated it in his article. A defeated army and a broken army are two different things. An army merely defeated in battle can often make successful withdrawals, reform itself, and reconstitute its strength as Rome did after its humiliation at Cannae, eventually, however, destroying its rival Carthage. But he says when whole armies break, when they lose their will to fight, the whole nation can break as well. This, he says, is what happened to the great empires of World War I. He then continues to say that this is also the fate awaiting the Ukrainian army. So how does a nation at war get to a place where its fighters refuse to fight? Well, Mr. Vlahos says that part of what breaks an army is attrition, resulting from both casualties and the trauma that comes along with battlefield losses. But armies can fight in spite of huge casualties, as we saw in World War I, and we see this same thing occurring with Ukraine even after an estimated over 500,000 killed in action since the beginning of this year. Yet, the Ukrainians have continued to fight on. But there are three factors, Mr. Vlahos said, that will sap an army's morale and commitment. First is when the initial high hopes suddenly turn into despair as the war seems more and more unwinnable. Second, when external support from friends begins to evaporate. And lastly, when those who, and I quote, initiated the war, who promised a road paved with victory, and who vowed that the world would support the army until victory was won, no matter how long it takes, are increasingly seen as liars and deceivers. My friends, all three of these factors have descended upon Ukraine. The facts are that the Ukrainian army has not won a major battle since the twin fall offensives of 2022, and in which, my opinion, were not even battlefield victories for the Ukrainian army to begin with. Second, Western support is dwindling, and the last aid package, which took over 6 months to get through the Congress, assigns a mere $14 billion to the US defense contractors to, at some unstated point in the future, build and procure weapons to send to the front lines of Ukraine, which I have stated many times I don't think will ever arrive. And lastly, and what may be the focus of this video, the internal conflict within the Ukrainian leadership that has severely exacerbated with the recent Russian offensive to the Kharkiv region. And that's where I'll start today. So let's get into it. The changing language used by the Ukrainian army in 72 hours of daily updates tells a story. Ongoing defensive fighting, significantly worsened Russian tactical success. What I just read was the opening sentence in CNN's article published yesterday. You rarely ever see Kiev's top brass sounding downbeat, but their steep southerly trajectory reflects the grave place Ukraine finds itself, writes the CNN. Russia, they say, is not just advancing slowly in one place. It appears to be advancing in 4 across the front line. And we will get into a frontline update of the hotspots of the northern and eastern fronts in Ukraine later on in this video. CNN says that Ukraine's rhetorical response has been telling. Its leaders have for once said how bad it really is. They appear to be shuffling commanders around, which is not something you do in the heat of battle without desperate reasons. And this, my friends, appears to be the cause of the increasing divisions within the Ukrainian political and military leadership. CNN reports that there is a vocal criticism of the failure to prepare and fortify the northern border regions over the past year ahead of Russia's recent Kharkiv offensive. And it's not just in Kharkiv. Along much of the front line, CNN now reports that in the near-rear areas, fortifications seem wanting, if not entirely absent. 2 articles have recently come out, one from the BBC and another from Ukraine's very own Ukrainska Pravda, which illustrate how poorly the Ukrainian army is prepared for what is about to come, and more importantly, as to Mr. Vlahos' third factor of collapse, how little trust there is that exists between the Ukrainian military and their own government. The BBC wrote an alarming article yesterday entitled "The Russians Simply Walked In. Ukrainian Troops in Kharkiv Tell BBC." It's based on an interview with the commander of the Ukrainian Special Reconnaissance Unit, Denis Yaroslavsky, who is described as being quite angry. Denis wants to know what happened to Ukraine's defenses, as the Russians now claim they have entered the vital town of Vovchansk. Denis stated that there was no first line of defense. We saw it. The Russians just walked in. They just walked in without any minefields. Officials, he said, claimed that defenses were being built at huge cost, but in his view, those defenses simply were not there. Either it was an act of negligence or corruption. It was not a failure, he says. It was, he said, a betrayal. And what makes this worse is that everyone knew that this incursion was likely to happen. Both Ukrainian and Western intelligence knew that Russia had been building forces across the border, with estimates of Russia amassing up to 30,000 troops. My friends, we know that President Putin also publicly stated his goal to create a buffer zone inside Kharkiv region to protect Russian territory from Ukrainian artillery strikes.
Protect his country was to create a security zone.
We will be forced at some point, when we deem it appropriate, to create a certain sanitary zone in the current territories under Kyiv's regime's control. To create a security zone that will be quite difficult to cross with the means of destruction that the enemy is using. Primarily, of course, of foreign manufacture.
Yet despite all this forewarning, Ukraine appears to have been ill-prepared, as the BBC reports. This has prompted President Zelensky to replace the Ukrainian commander responsible for the northeastern Kharkiv front line.
Харківщина. Тривають наші контрударні дії. Напрямок посилено, зокрема, Вовчанськ та загалом прикордонні райони. Бригадний генерал Михайло Драпатий за цей напрямок відповідає безпосередньо на місці. Йому надаються необхідні засоби ураження.
And it is because, as the Daily Telegraph reported in their recent update, it is because it comes amid reports that Ukrainian defenses were, and get this, built in the wrong place to halt Russia's Kharkiv offensive. Yuri Budanov, a Ukrainian journalist, said, and I quote, "Kiev is now building defense lines in more tactically advantageous positions after it found the main battles were taking place where positions were not equipped." Meanwhile, the aforementioned Ukrainian commander, Denis, fears that on the front line, where Russians, he says, have entered the edge of the town of Vovchansk, could soon be back in Russian hands. To make matters worse, the Ukrainians are reportedly being outgunned by a ratio of 10-1 in terms of artillery fire, says the BBC. But what is more concerning, at least in my mind, is this statement right here. And I quote, that reinforcements being sent by Ukraine to the Kharkiv region are being pulled from other parts of the front, and reserves are already limited. That was the thumbnail of my most recent video, No Reserves Left. This point was echoed by General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, who is also referred to as Ukraine's top spy chief in an interview with the New York Times. General Budanov said that Russians' attacks in the northeast are intended to stretch Ukraine's already thin reserves of soldiers and divert them from fighting elsewhere. He then said that this is exactly what is happening now, and here's a quote directly from General Budanov to the New York Times in the interview. "All of our forces are either here or in Chasiv Yar. I have used everything we have. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone else in the reserves." And it gets even more interesting. The general, although he expects that by committing the last of his reserves, Ukraine would eventually be able to shore up the front within the next few days. General Budanov expects Russia to, and get this, launch a new attack further north of Kharkiv to the Sumy region. Such a plan of attack would make perfect sense to me for the Russians to do. This was one of the main purposes of the Bogosian rebellion, as I set out in this video right here. Those Wagnerians who were supposed to be in exile in Belarus have been training Belarusian troops. They may sweep south to attack Sumy, opening yet another front. This will expand the front line from Kherson all the way up to Belarus and completely stretch the Ukrainian army to reach a final breaking point. If that is the case, then Ukraine will almost certainly collapse this summer. And no amount of weapons, if they ever arrive, could assist, because they won't know where to send those weapons to along the massive front line, and further, they won't have any reserves left to equip before sending to the front line. And staying on this topic of Ukraine's defensive, or the lack thereof, in the Kharkiv region and other areas of the Eastern Front, a very formidable journalist who is also the chairman of Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Center asked this loaded question in an article that she wrote that is now making headlines in Ukraine in their newspaper, Ukrainska Pravda. Where are the fortifications? Kharkiv OVA paid millions to fictitious firms. Hundreds of millions of Ukraine's currency could have been stolen on the construction of fortifications in the Kharkiv region. The journalist makes a strong case for massive corruption as she claims that the Department of Kharkiv shows newly registered and no-name firms whose owners, she said, do not resemble successful businessmen, as they have dozens of court cases ranging from theft to domestic violence. Well, for those of you who know anything about Ukraine, this should not be a surprise in a country that is rated as one of, if not the most corrupt country in Europe. Now, to be fair, and I want to be impartial, Sky News reports that the governor of the Kharkiv province, Ole Sinyohubov, has rejected criticism about the alleged lack of Ukrainian fortifications along the border shared with Russia, insisting the defenses were strong even though, as Sky News takes the time to point out, Russian forces continue to capture multiple villages. You have to choose between a politician and what a military man says on the front line. This clearly contradicts the aforementioned Commander Dennis, who himself told Sky News that, and I quote, "In 2 years, there should have been fortifications on the Ukrainian border by now." Drone footage also supports him that has been posted on social media, and it shows foot soldiers, Russian foot soldiers, advancing across a field on the Ukrainian side of the border completely unchallenged, according to Sky News. A platoon commander, also defending the border, said it would have been impossible to build any fortifications because Russia bombs the crap out of that area all the time. The platoon commander therefore blames the lack of fortifications in Kharkiv on the lack of sufficient weapons from the west to deter Russians shelling. And briefly as to the frontline situation in Kharkiv, General Syrskyi admitted that the situation has significantly worsened as one Ukrainian unit, according to Al Jazeera, had to withdraw, leaving behind more land to Russian forces across less defended settlements in the supposed grey zone of the Kharkiv region. Vladimir Timoshko, head of the Kharkiv Regional Police, said Russian forces were on the outskirts of the town of Vovchansk. And while Russia continues to advance and capture more and more village on the Kharkiv border with Belgorod, focusing on extending the buffer zone rather than any deep penetrations yet, Let's take a brief look at the front line further south near the important town of Chasiv Yar. Newsweek reported that Russia had amassed up to 25,000 soldiers around the strategic settlement of Chasiv Yar, which sits west of the Russian-controlled city of Bakhmut, and which the Institute for the Study of War described as a fortress city. Reports from Ukraine claim that they repelled a dozen attacks close to Bakhmut in the previous 24 hours, including around the villages of Kleshivka and Ivaniski. Ukrainska Pravda reports that the Russians were trying to find weak points in Ukraine's defense by approaching the city of Chasiv Yar from Ivaniski and Budanov. So it seems to me that the Russians have abandoned, at least for now, the tactic of sending large-scale assaults, and instead they send mobilized convicts as a first wave while keeping their equipment in reserve.